So I'm here today with Clinton Ohlers, who is a vice president of SafeBlood and head of media relations. And we connected on, of course, X. We're connected with a lot of people. And Clinton is addressing a concern that many of us have about the safety of our blood supply following the rollout of these modified mRNA COVID shots that, in my opinion, are not clearing the system like they were promised to. And yeah, a friend of mine on X, her husband underwent surgery. She tried to get donor directed blood. So that what that means is that before you go into a planned surgery where there's a higher likelihood that you might need a transfusion, you might want to just donate your own blood in advance and then store that blood and then use it if necessary, because your body can has if the body has time, it can just regenerate more red blood cells and regenerate the blood, but the hospital would not let her do that. So that's how Clinton saw me posting about that, and then we connected, and here we are. So thanks so much, Clinton, for coming on.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, how long has SafeBlood been around, and tell us what SafeBlood does?
Oh gosh. Well, so what we do is we meet the needs of exactly the kind of situation that you brought up there, where you have a patient who's going in for surgery and they are concerned that the blood coming off the shelf, they can assume is going to have a 70 to 80% chance of coming from an mRNA vaccinated donor. And we're still figuring out what the complete gamut of risks are associated with blood from those donors, especially if you yourself are unvaccinated, or if you're somebody who was vaccinated and maybe had an adverse reaction, or you're just somebody, say, who, like my parents, got the vaccine thinking that the benefits outweigh the risk, and they just would prefer to avoid further exposure. So we match donors with recipients, and especially in cases where they might not have enough blood to do an autologous donation, which is what you describe when somebody donates to themselves ahead of time. We had somebody who needed 14 units of blood in Florida, and another woman in Missouri needed 4 to 6, going ahead of a planned C-section, and another woman in Los Angeles needed 10 units of blood. So very often people need more blood than they could provide for themselves if they're a candidate for autologous donation, or this case, I think you're referring to a case in Texas at Baylor St. Luke's. Is that correct?
I believe you.
Yeah. And in that case, they had friends and family too who were willing to donate. So you don't have to go through us, but a lot of people find it that they really need our matching system to meet their needs. So that's what we do. And you asked when we started. It was September of 2021, because back in August of that year, naturopaths and other doctors in Europe who are looking at the blood under magnification started seeing these anomalies that normally were associated with, I don't want to be too dramatic, but in some cases with, late stage cancer patients, but now in patients who are walking around with even without symptoms. But the common denominator was that they were all vaccinated. So even if it wasn't affecting the person immediately or perhaps ever, everyone they looked at had anomalies in their blood. And of course, this isn't surprising in retrospect, because if you recall when the British data came out about looking at 2022 versus 2021, they had found, now we were up from the 2021 to 2022 year, 522% increase in claims on blood-related illnesses in the UK. So it clearly was affecting the blood, and that was very predictable looking at the blood under magnification. And so within a month of that, our founder, George Della Pietra, had gotten SafeBlood up and running in Switzerland, and that's where we started. So we're international, went over 55 countries, and we have members in every state in the U.S. The U.S. is really our largest base of operation because it's still the freest. Like you cannot get what we do in Switzerland or in the European Union. And we can talk about that, but this is political, and this is something that's happened since the rollout of the mRNA vaccines. This is not normal. Well, donating to yourself, right? Safest blood you could have is your own blood. And certainly having healthy friends, family, relatives donate to you is not previously non-controversial and certainly not risky. So there's no reason to prohibit it.
Yeah. What is going on with that? Because the FDA has something on their website cautioning against this or advising hospitals not to allow it. Can
Yes,
you elaborate on that?
absolutely. So, well, this is that October 23rd statement by the FDA, and it basically tries to make the claim that directed donations are actually potentially more risky than just blood off the shelf, and so that patients should be dissuaded from this. And I'm calling this the horses and cows y'all next scandal with the FDA because it's based on science that badly misrepresented. And as you know, you fought so hard on that terrible tweet that they put out back in 21 that cost, how many lives did that tweet possibly cost? I mean, I'd love to get some researcher out there really looking at that has real consequences, right? Just like the suppression of hydroxychloroquine. You couldn't get people to sign up for hydroxychloroquine trials by the time they tried to roll out trials because people were so afraid of the drug that would clearly have saved, with azithromycin and proper zinc levels, something like 70 to 80% of the people that took it, and they were afraid to take it. So this kind of information does very real damage and harm to people, life-threatening and life-ending harm. And this misinformation on the FDA's website currently is on that level. And so how am I able to say that? Well, because they rely on a single study by Dorsey et al. Done that looked at directed donations between around 1995 and the early 2000s, and the study was done in 2013. So we're looking at this during a period where there was huge drop-off in directed donations because the AIDS scare was pretty much over, and people were no longer seeking directed donations in as high as numbers for that very reason. Now, what's misinformation, and it isn't really the study itself. It's that what the study found was that there was a higher incidence of things like hepatitis C and other infectious diseases that you would screen out of the blood before presenting it to a patient. And in this case, you discard the blood if it's got hep C or HIV or something. And they said, oh, well, there was a higher incidence of that among directed donors. But directed donors are typically new people coming into the system, right? So when you compare that with the stored blood at, say, American Red Cross, most of that's from repeat donors, right, who are already pre-screened. So, of course, being scientists, they said, well, that's apples and oranges, so we've got to factor that out. So once they adjusted for the fact that, to make it apples and apples, you adjust for the fact that you've got more new patients who've never been screened before, then it turned out that the odds ratios, dropped to 0.7. So actually what they found was the blood supply from directed donors was actually safer, but they said it wasn't statistically large enough to be significant. Now that's being misused by our FDA to try to scare people away from directed donations. And, I don't think they came up with it themselves. This is something that the big blood banks like American Red Cross and others, Vitalent, all the big ones come out to fight any legislation that emerges, and it's emerging everywhere, to protect these rights to directed and autologous donations. And they constantly quote Dorsey et al. But it's become easy pickings as those of us who are defending these rights come and testify. We just explain the science, and I think it's really becoming an embarrassment now.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure Red Cross has a lot to lose from a rise in directed donors. Am I right? I mean, they're a huge revenue generating company, right?
Yes, there are probably a lot of motives, but one of the things we're very skeptical about is how you hear always there's a blood shortage. And you always hear about there's a blood shortage. What people don't realize is that the blood industry is a $24 billion a year industry. And America is the greatest exporter of blood products. Okay,
Yeah.
it makes up 2.65% of our total exports are blood products.
What?
So, yeah, the U.S. has a vein open to the world. We,
Wow. That
yes,
is
we,
crazy.
isn't it? Yeah. So we're supplying, I think it's something like 70% of the blood products worldwide.
Wow.
So yeah, anything I
Is that because the men using testosterone, or what? Why? Or people are just more generous here? What's going
well, I
on?
just like to think the men in this country maybe have higher testosterone, but it, you know, that's a great one. I don't know the answer to that question, but I think it's just because we have, I mean, look, pretty much every state, the biggest employer is the medical industry. I think medicine is such a big industry in the United States, and this is just part of it. And, failure to screen the blood appropriately during the AIDS crisis meant that this export was also very dangerous, right? And so, in some sense, we're kind of living a bit of a um, repeat of that period.
Mhm.
But what I think I should point out is that there that's where I think the emergency is yeah, anything that might interfere with that business flow and that cash flow and their ability to designate blood as they choose for those lines of business, yeah, is a threat to the blood industry. Now how directly is something like the American Red Cross involved with that? Would be uh, that's a tricky question because they're a nonprofit, right? They make their money off of the the service that they provide of getting blood to the hospitals, and I think this is where that comes in. So, if you think that most blood transfusions these days are red or packed red blood cells, right? And then you've got platelets, and you have plasma, right? Well, when you need whole blood, then typically that's reformulated, right? Nurses and doctors tell me, well, most of the time when we need more blood, we've got to reformulate it from the other products that's been broken down. So
Mhm.
I think probably there is money that's being made off of separating these things out. And then if you need whole blood, reconstituting them. And directed donors come into the system, they just say, well, I've got my donor. All we need is a blood draw, and they give it to me. And I think there's probably
Oh.
a lot less money involved in that. That's what I suspect.
So for safe blood, is it just do you do just whole blood or do you break it down?
Yeah, because what we're doing is matching, right? We're not a blood bank actually providing blood. Where it's like, let's say you and I and this is how it would work. Like, this is how it worked actually. If my wife's aunt had pancreatic cancer, needed transfusion, she just went and found members from her church, right?
Mhm.
And said, hey, I'd just be more comfortable with blood that I know who it's coming from. And so, yeah, so like if two people are a match, right, then one, you just have to organize it through the doctor
Mhm.
and the blood bank that the hospital works with. Every hospital contracts with one and only one blood bank. And so we coordinate the meeting of the parties so that you get your blood in time for surgery.
Okay, so you just coordinate directed donations basically, but you're not collecting the blood or storing the blood or any of that.
Oh, yes, correct. And the reason for that is not that this may be very useful to do down the road, but it just wouldn't have been efficient, particularly not in the early days of the pandemic. The most efficient, fastest way to get blood to an individual is by matching a donor with a recipient and just letting them go and do it, right? Because also, and I actually talked with Peter McCullough about this, and he warned us away from it because he said, look, you would be highly regulated, and the
Hmm.
regulatory agencies are not on our side,
Right.
right? So and the other thing is this gets it just in time. There's no waste, right? Because members show up, give it to people who need it. It's as fresh as it can be, right? Blood stays on the shelf typically up to about 40 days, but the longer it's there, the less robust it is. And so, as you can imagine, they're going to be moving blood from the back of the shelf forward, as kind of like milk at the grocery store. They're not going to put the freshest stuff out first. They want to move out that older stock. So there's a lot of reasons that this is better for people. And certainly there's some, like these rare cases like beta thalassemia, where say there's a case of a couple of gals in Texas, young girls who they don't produce their own red blood cells. And so they survive by transfusions. And in that kind of case, a directed donation is absolutely critical because that allows them to get the freshest possible blood.
What's the demand like from the public for the service you're providing?
Boy, that is a great question. That is really kind of $1 million question. All we know is that it's increasing.
Mhm.
So far, we've been able to meet every need that's been presented to us. And I think that's one of the great things about how we're doing this, because we have thousands of members all over the country, many of whom are just donor members. They say, hey, we can't afford to help you out financially by way of being a monthly member, but we want to be available to help fellow Americans get the blood that they need. And so uh, the there's no compensation or remuneration for them. They're doing this all voluntarily. But like I said, there's many thousands of them, so that we have donors in every state, and typically within an hour or less than most cities, or probably within 3 hours of just about every city. So there's a lot of people doing this, and we know that demand is up because the resistance is up, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Is the resistance overt, or is it just subtle things like the FDA putting something on their website saying we don't approve of directed donations?
Well, that's not so subtle, right? Because the reason they did that, if you look at the documentation the FDA uses to support itself, it's this statement by Dorsey, it's the study by Dorsey, and then a statement by the big blood associations. So it was definitely, in my opinion, the tail wagging the dog in this case. It's not like the FDA said, we have these concerns, we better alert American Red Cross and America's blood centers, right? So rather, it looks very much like the reverse order. And so what does that allow, though? So let's go back to this case in Texas, right? This individual was denied blood from his wife, who is a universal donor, was denied blood from friends, okay? Then they said, well, could he give his own blood? Now, that surgery was 2 weeks out, from what I understand, and he wasn't told, hey, you can't do that because there's not enough time. They were simply always told, we'll only do it if it's medically necessary. Well, that's a very fluid term, right? Under what, right? And so the answer is that medically necessary is virtually can always be no, right?
Right.
Except in some very rare cases. So they use something like that to say, well, we don't say you can't do this, but only if it's medically necessary. And it sounds very responsible, but it's just a way to prevent it. And so they even said his own blood only if medically necessary, which is astonishing, of course, I think, to most people in the medical field, because certainly your own blood would be the safest if there's enough time to replenish and so forth. So, I spoke with the family and I said, well, what you need to do then is called the cell saver technology. So this is something everybody listening to this program should know about, is the cell saver system is when you actually recycle your own blood. And on this individual's case, it was he needed an aneurysm repaired and a valve replaced, right? And so in open heart surgery, that's very commonly where they use this very effectively. Now, if you're like a cancer patient having cancer removed, or you're bleeding out from, say, an ulcer or something, then obviously they can't recycle your own blood. But in a lot of cases, they can. The important thing for everybody to know is the hospitals don't just offer this. You have to ask, and they can schedule it. It actually costs less than blood off the shelf, but they don't offer it. And they won't tell you about it if you are presenting concerns and saying, like, this is something that I found very interesting. I've heard several times people say, yeah, they don't, I found out about this, but they didn't tell me. Like, one woman was saying, well, I think I'm going to just forego blood.
Right.
And then it was only at that point, right before the surgery, not when she said she was going to forego receiving blood, and she's a doctor herself, right? But right before the surgery, when her doctor realized this was for real, she said, well, we do have the cell saver technology. And I should clarify, I can't remember if she's a MD or a PhD, but the point was, she's a really highly educated person and was very determined about this. And they didn't tell her till the last minute. And that's when we kind of started to learn, wow, they're not going to just tell patients the cell saver exists just because, if they show resistance to taking blood off the shelf. So everybody should know about that. That should be a first line of request. That's what this family did in Texas. And then, ultimately didn't need blood transfusion. So that averted that crisis.
Yeah.
But so what was so dangerous about the FDA statement, which is, I think, what you were talking about, it allows these hospitals to be justified in what they're doing, because they say, well, we're in line with the FDA, right? And Baylor St. Luke's in Texas, I'm told by other people around the country, that that's a particularly difficult system to work with, right?
Mhm.
Because what you have to have is, your doctor, of course, uh, needs to be in agreement with you. And obviously, might be some cases where you couldn't give to yourself or so forth. But um, there's some cases where a husband and wife might not be ideal if they're planning to have children. So obviously, you want to do this in consultation with your doctor. But it's not doctors who we found who are resistant to it. It's hospital administrations and blood banks. So in the case of that Texas one, Baylor St. Luke's, the blood bank was willing to do the directed donation, but Baylor St. Luke's wasn't. So
Crazy.
if that hadn't worked, then they would have had to, find another hospital. So, and it was too late in the game to do that.
I know there's some states that are passing legislation along these lines. What exactly are states trying to push through in regards to blood donations?
Well, yeah, this is a great question. Primarily, the main legislation that we're seeing is to protect the right to give to yourself autologous donation and the right for directed donations. And I just last week testified before the Idaho Senate committee, and before that, before the House committee that put it to the floor. So it passed the House, passed on the floor in the House, and now it's passed this Senate committee. And I did so with really strong support. It was almost unanimous, only one dissenter against the bill. And now, why was that so popular in Idaho? Well, because Idaho has been one of those states where you can't get this done because the American Red Cross will say, well, we don't have a national policy against directed donations, but they leave it up to the state director. And in Idaho, from what I understand, the state director was very antithetical to this, and pretty much nobody in Idaho was getting directed donations. And my understanding is even autologous donations were also being hampered. So we know of one patient who had to go all the way to Utah just to get find a hospital where he could get his surgery done and get the blood that he felt comfortable with. Now, the other interesting thing about this legislation was so many of the senators themselves, the state senators, had personal experience with this, either had to have gone in for surgery themselves or had a loved one or friend who did or knew someone and saw them get denied. So I've never seen a American Red Cross representative quite as nervous as at that legislative hearing, because she had just come out and said that nobody's being denied directed donations here, which was, I don't know how she could think that and be honest at the same time, because Idaho was hugely blocked, and you had people actually in the committee who knew that this were the case, and you had a whole string of doctors saying, no, we need this legislation because we can't get this blood.
Mm-hmm. What other states have any states
Uh,
passed legislation?
Not yet. It almost passed in Texas last year and was basically blocked by some parliamentary trickery. Somebody who was supposedly a proponent of the bill was supposed to advance it to its next stage after passing both houses, and then it expired. So this was a case where it should have passed, but legislative tricks prevented it. And so Idaho, therefore, is a very important case because that would be the first one in the country. Now, there's bills in Tennessee, one in Kentucky's going forward. I also testified in, South Dakota for a very different bill. That was to require separation and marking of mRNA vaccinated versus unvaccinated donors. Now, that didn't pass, but that would have been excellent. We can talk about that in a second. But there's, over 10 or 12 states now. It changes daily, but I think as of the last count, it's 12 that have put these forward. And as soon as one passes, it'll be very important to open the door. But there was even a training video that Pfizer took part in on how to dissuade patients from requesting directed donations or going through with directed donations. And in that video, the Pfizer representative talks about the Texas bill and how important it was to defeat that. And they said, we can't let this pass
What?
anywhere.
Why? Why is Pfizer so concerned about it?
It's a great question, isn't it? I don't know, but it is very suspicious.
Well, it's, I guess, verging onto another topic is testing of the blood, right? So if you can't get an autologous donation or you can't get a direct donation, well, can you test it for mRNA? Because, and maybe that's why Pfizer is getting all into this issue. I mean,
One of the things is like I said, it's a $24 billion a year industry, and they don't want. This is what's so interesting. Finally, in Idaho, what the resistance finally came down to is that this bill would imply that the blood supply is unsafe,
right.
because all the other arguments were shattered, and nobody can argue with that. Yeah, that bill would imply some ways that the blood supply may be unsafe, and that's everybody's concern. And look, everybody has a right to protect themselves from that possibility until it's known for certain that it is safe. But we have tons of evidence that it isn't safe. Lots of people that have died or been injured. So I think that's part of what these large corporations are probably fighting, is that they don't want that news widespread. And because it creates questions for other blood-derived products, IVIG and all of these important treatments.
Well, as it should, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But how does it work if somebody's interested in using SafeBlood? What's the process?
Well, what you do is you go to our website, safeblood.com, and you become a member. Ideally, yeah, like let's say you found out you need surgery in 2 weeks. Okay, go and we can do an urgent match for you. That's just a service that we provide. And typically, though, people are members. It's a little bit more like insurance, right? People are monthly members. But what I like to say is that there's so much more that we're doing than matching donors with blood. This is a fight to protect the blood supply for future generations and for your friends and neighbors. So in a way, we hope that none of our members actually need a blood transfusion, right? But it's something that you want to be a part of, hoping that you don't need it, but doing a real good by making our fight possible. So we've got monthly memberships, lifetime memberships. Like a lifetime membership is $1,000, and that covers a person for life or any minor in their household. But for most people's budgets, it's $100 a year. Actually, what we could do is we could give a coupon on this show if you'd like, and that would bring it down to $100 a year with the coupon. And for monthly members, it would erase the sign-up fee, because there's a sign-up fee and then there's a monthly fee of $10 a month.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, if you'd, what would you like the coupon to be?
I don't know. You could just say Dr. Mary.
Dr. Mary. Okay, so we'll use Dr. Mary. I'll put it up once we finish the call. And that would just waive the fee for anybody who wants to join and take 10% off an annual membership or off of one of those lifetime memberships. But those are really important to us. For people who come and join us financially, that really keeps the fight going, keeps us testifying before, these different state governments. Testifying does take a lot of time and is a real challenge, because you really have to be aware of the arguments that are going to be used against you ahead of time. And those they've become kind of boilerplate now, because there really aren't any good arguments against these bills. But the fight is still very intense because, for some reason, interests as large as Pfizer are saying we can't allow a single one of these to pass in a single state.
Yeah, I can't agree. The whole having people available who can testify at these hearings in the state senates and House of Representatives is so important. In Texas, they just slipped this bill under the radar where they're streamlining licensing for foreign trained doctors. And it wasn't on my radar at all. If you're not really tuning into what's happening, bills just get either swept in or completely ignored, and you have no idea. And so what you're doing, where you actually are paying attention and you're going and testifying, is super important. So I really applaud you for doing that. Do you think Texas will try to revitalize the bill? Do you remember who authored it?
I can't remember the author offhand, but I am sure that it's going forward again this legislative season, because this one really should have passed.
Yeah.
Right. There's
common sense.
It was a done deal.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that was such a compelling case there in Texas because you had two little girls who had have beta thalassemia that I mentioned earlier, and they had their parents, their adoptive parents, went to great lengths to find donors, to screen them. They had to go through hundreds of donors to get the ones that they got. And these donors had been giving these girls blood for about 10 years. And then suddenly, Carter Blood supply, or Carter Blood, excuse me, in Texas just cut them off, just said, we're not doing this anymore. And they claimed, of course, that there was no harm by getting blood off the shelf. But these girls saw a significant decline in their health because now they were getting older blood. One of the little girls got oral herpes from
Mm-hmm.
the blood off the shelf. And I think it was actually very telling because you have these two little girls are like kind of the canaries in the coal mine, showing that they got a much better blood product when they had donors lined up giving that to them.
Yeah. So was it the blood bank that blocked them, or what is Carter Blood?
Yeah, they're okay. So there's a lot of other blood banks than say just the American Red Cross. So like up in Montana, Wyoming, that area, you've got Vitalent. In like in the south, the southeast is fantastic. The blood bank that primarily operates in Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Florida, they don't charge anything extra for getting a directed donation and are very conducive to it. But Carter in Texas just decided not to do it. And every hospital you see is contracted with a single blood bank. So if they're contracted with Carter and there's another blood bank, say, hypothetically down the street that would do it, you can't swap it out, right? They are only going to work with the blood bank that they're contracted with. So there's these multiple hurdles, like we saw in Texas, of both the hospital and the blood bank have to be aligned. And it's really a human right anyhow. And like I said, it was non-controversial in any way prior to COVID-19 and the rollout of the vaccine. So we need to make it non-controversial. Again, we can do that with these state laws.
Yeah. Are during these testimonies in the states, are they citing the FDA as a reason? Has anybody done that so far that you know of?
That's a good question. I haven't seen it yet. But yeah, that would be good. I'd love to ask more about it because that actually was a question that I had when you put that post up, because I thought, well, this is interesting. I haven't seen people pointing to this. Now, I did have a reporter, Washington Post reporter, try to interview me, and she, I think, referenced to that indirectly. I didn't end up taking the interview because it was clear, in my opinion, from our interaction, that this was just designed to be a hit piece. But so I think so it's out there having some influence. That was so interesting is that we haven't heard all of this resistance based on this FDA statement, but I'm sure among the internal conversations in the hospitals, this becomes the justification. Now, there is something to me that's interesting about the timing of that. That was October of 23, and it was October 23rd. And that was a period when this was really just becoming more and more into the public consciousness of that they might have a need for blood transfusions from non-mRNA vaccinated donors. And on the 20th, I was on Del Bigtree's The High Wire. And I think that interview really helped make this certainly more widely well known. And so it was just curious timing that 3 days later, this popped up on the FDA's site. I don't know if they're connected or not, but it was pretty curious timing.
No, the timing always maps out. That's your first clue. So I am certain they saw your interview and certain the timing was not coincidental. When they came out with their horse tweet, that was the very end of August 2021. And so this was during the third and largest surge of the pandemic. So this was 9 months following the rollout of these shots that were supposed to save the world. And yet we were seeing just an explosion of COVID and people exploding into the hospitals. And the government was upset because people were not getting as many shots as they wanted them to get. And so they had to go after ivermectin. The timing was very strategic. August 23rd, 2021. And then a couple weeks later, Biden mandated the shots, which is
Mhm.
not a
Mhm.
coincidence.
Okay.
So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. You can sound a little bit like a conspiracy theorist, right? Saying, well, gee, these look like they must be related. So, but it's when aren't they related? Especially when it's a falsehood. Like, why does a lie appear at a certain time? Just
Right.
randomly? I don't
Right.
think so.
Right. Exactly. Well, thank you so much, Clinton. Is there anything else you want to add before we sign off or?
Yeah, absolutely. Please, go to our website, safeblood.com. Another way to support us is you could follow us on Substack. People could do so much, like they don't have to be a paid member. Like maybe it's not in your budget, but if you are not mRNA vaccinated and want to join up as a donor member, that's absolutely free. And it's a huge help to this fight. Just retweeting our tweets that we're on X at safe_blood3. We're on Substack. We get a lot of members through the Substack, and people who are members get the Substack free. Or if you're a paid Substack subscriber, then you get a complimentary membership at SafeBlood. I mean, they're the same price. And so, but yeah, sure, just restacking my posts there is really valuable. And hey, let me maybe end with a public service announcement for pregnant mothers. Okay, because this is something we didn't talk about was emergencies. And Dr. James Thorpe has asked me to really, whenever I can, get this message out, and that we open talking about autologous donations where you give to yourself. And the Red Cross allows, and it's actually more recent. They didn't used to, but they now allow mothers to donate to themselves ahead of pregnancy. And so for moms going in to give birth who are concerned, well, gee, what if I have an issue and I need blood while, because of the delivery, they can bank their own blood ahead of time. And you can actually even do that if you're doing a home birth. You can have that blood for you at the hospital that you'd be transferred to. And so this is a really important issue for James Thorpe. He and I are both working on a study to look at individuals who have been harmed by blood transfusions. Their only exposure to mRNA vaccine components ostensibly was through a transfusion, and they had adverse reactions up to including death that are typical uh, only really of the mRNA vaccines. And why do I say like an infant that gets myocarditis or an infant that has a clot running all the way from the knee to the heart and dies? And I mean, we're talking a newborn infant whose only exposure to anything was the transfusion, in this case, the famous baby Alex case. So we do have a lot of these cases of harm. People are wise to protect themselves. Pregnant mothers can protect themselves in this manner. And we do need to push legislation, I think, like the bill that did fail in South Dakota, which is to have blood segregated. Because look, in an emergency situation, not even I can get blood that I am guaranteed to be mRNA free, because in an emergency, you have to take what's off the shelf. But if we were just marking, even with a Sharpie mark on blood, a bag of blood that's from a non-mRNA vaccinated donor, that could be available in emergencies for people who request it. You mentioned testing. We're really excited about testing that we believe is going to be coming online in America in the next few months. We've been talking with a leading company that's doing that, and that would again empower the patients, because if that test exists and it's available ahead of your surgery, and if it's available rapidly, it doesn't take a long turnaround time, then patients and their advocates could request, say, can you test what's in that bag of blood before it goes into my loved one? Because if there's a high presence of spike protein or SV40, right, then that would be good to know.
What did blood banks screen for now?
Primarily things like HIV, the different hepatitis C, hepatitis B.
That's it. Yeah.
I mean, there's a few,
Well,
right?
wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much, Clinton. And I hope everybody will go to SafeBlood and safeblood.com. Is that it? Or
Yeah,
safeblood.org?
safeblood.com.
Okay. And yeah, this is super interesting and something that needs way more attention. So thank you so much for doing this.